Hello and welcome to Cinema to the Letter. This episode is that atypical film known as Return to Oz. On Cinema to the Letter, we break down the very nature of cinema letter by letter. For each episode of a film miniseries topic, we cover 6 films that fit a C for classic, I for indie, N for new, E for egregious, M for masterpiece, and A for atypical. Who doesn't love an acronym, am I right? I am Thomas, and this is one of my many heads that I wear on a daily basis. I have a big closet I switch around between. It depends on how I feel that day.
I noticed that about you, actually. Oh, hello. I am Bryan, and I also can't sleep. I feel you, Dorothy.
Yes, welcome everybody to the final episode of our Disney season. Bryan can't believe it's ending here. And we always promise A for atypical to end the season. And right. We're talking about Return to Oz today, and of the Disney catalog, I think you can very much agree with me that this is not typical as a Disney production.
No, this is quite a strange film. One of the most fitting we could have picked for an atypical, I think.
Right, honestly, because that's when we decided on Disney, I was insistent this has to be the A for atypical, because
right.
The thing is, with a lot of the other potential choices for this, it's kind of movies that could, still conceivably have been made by Disney at some point, I think.
Right.
Ones that we were vaguely contemplating. But with Return to Oz, it feels so incredibly odd, despite the fact that obviously this is adapted from the L. Frank Baum stories and characters and whatnot. And on paper, Oz seems perfect for Disney, to the degree that there's a weird history with Disney and Oz. Basically, back in the 1930s, Walt Disney himself had wanted to make a Wizard of Oz adaptation as pretty much the second animated feature after Snow White. But then MGM scooped up the rights and made a film with Judy Garland no one remembers at all. Not at all an iconic and classic film, but has still kind of arguably clouded any other film adaptation, including this one.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I guess to kind of talk very briefly about The Wizard of Oz, one of the greatest films of all time. Indisputable, I think. Even, as someone who... I watched that movie for the first time, a few years ago, and I was like, oh, this is good. And then I rewatched it, last year, I believe, and I was like, oh, no, this is, one of the, 5 greatest movies ever made, I think. It is just an unbelievably beautiful movie that, really, wins you over. It's this weird thing of, we'll talk about the various attempts to make a sequel, make a other stuff in the Oz verse, I guess. Yeah, it's very weird. But I mean, what is your kind of relationship to The Wizard of Oz?
I think it's much more traditional in terms of I saw it when I was a little kid, and right. I loved it. It was probably one of the first movies I remember being obsessed with as a small child, just because I watched it constantly on VHS. It was definitely one I remember, Oz sort of permeating a lot of my childhood. I remember my dad took me to a traveling musical show that went from city to city that actually starred Eartha Kitt as the witch and Mickey Rooney as the wizard. That I remember seeing at a very young age. Because I was just in love with this movie, and I think that's kind of the weird thing, is that with The Wizard of Oz itself, it's such a classic movie. Anybody would recognize, just Yellow Brick Road, the Judy Garland's outfit as Dorothy, the various different versions of the Scarecrow, Tin Man and Lion, those specific designs.
The Wicked Witch, right?
Right, the Wicked Witch, all that other stuff. It feels so inherently memorable to anybody out there that
right.
I wanted to watch more Oz movies and prep for this, but the trouble is that like 90% of the movies that are like adapted from Oz are just like, let's go as close as we can to the 1939 movie without getting sued. Like, to the degree that, like, Warner Brothers, who owns the rights now, made a fucking straight-to-video Tom and Jerry movie where they just put them into The Wizard of Oz. The same musical numbers, audio of Judy Garland, all the other actors and shit. It's just Tom and Jerry also are there.
Right. It's a weird thing where, like, I only dug into kind of the, like, you know, the main kind of 4 movies that they've made of, like, you know, studio films that have been made based on this story, but I feel like most of it is just either parodies or like homages to that 1939, right? 1939?
Yes, 1939.
To that like original movie, which is it's a weird thing to kind of get into, I think.
Yeah, now nearly 100 years later, it's still untouchable. Weird.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
like,
mean, yeah.
Aside from this movie, which decides, like, let's go back to the source material and do something a bit more, like, dark and upsetting, even though a lot of people talk about how the 1939 movie is scary, which it can be, especially if you're a little kid, like The Wicked Witch, The Flying Monkeys, all that other shit. Like, it genuinely can terrify a young kid because there's that sense of danger. And that's kind of what was so great about, like, L. Frank Baum's stories. Like, if you go back and read any of them, like, I've only read the first book, which I did back when I was in elementary school. And even then I noticed, like, oh, this is a lot darker. Like, there's a whole sequence where, like, the Tin Man literally, like, mutilates a bunch of, like, creatures that are attacking them with his axe. Like, he chops them up and shit.
Right. I mean, yeah, it kind of reminds me of, you know, when you read those, like, the Grimm fairy tales or any of those kind of old, like, stories like that where, like, oh, these are a lot darker and, like, you know, grittier than you think, because, like, yeah, we all think of The Wizard of Oz as this, like, and it is a very beautiful and, like, sweet and moving movie, but yeah, there is that kind of, like, you know, fantasy stuff in there that kind of goes into a bit of horror at times, which is what's so interesting about that movie, is that it is both, like, beauty and wonder and everything, and also these weird creatures and this weird world and, like, yeah, all that stuff.
And distinctly also a very American world, because that's sort of the thing that a lot of people talk about, and I do agree with it. It's like, it's one of the few fantasy universes that doesn't feel based in, like, Britain or any of these other things. Culturally, L. Frank Baum, like, very much made it like an American story, with, like, a scarecrow and a Tin Man in particular, kind of, like, representing, like, farms, then industry, the Industrial Revolution, and then Cowardly Lion, politicians. Oh! Boom! Roasted. Damn. That's the extent of our political commentary for the evening. But yeah, it's weird, especially because the only other Oz thing I watched actually in prep for this was weirdly one I had not heard of, that's called 20th Century Oz from 1976. It's an Australian movie, appropriate for Oz. And it's like a version of it where
Australia?
Basically. And it's about, like, this young girl who's, like, a groupie for, like, a rock and roll band, who, like, while she's, like, in the van that they're, like, driving around, like, she falls out of the car, and then she has a fantasy of, like, being in Australia, but it's this weird version of Australia. You know, the version of the Scarecrow is a surfer dude, played by Bruce Spence, of, like, the Mad Max movies. Oh, which is, like, the gyrocopter guy.
Yeah, okay.
And then the version of the Tin Man is a heartless mechanic. And then the version of the Lion is like this wannabe biker dude. It's very weird. It's a very odd film. But it feels still, it's at the same time indebted to the 1939 movie at the same time. Which is like a big thing, obviously, to differentiate from A Return to Oz. Which, let's just jump into Return to Oz. Now let's play the trailer for Return to Oz.
This summer, Walt Disney Pictures presents a motion picture fantasy adventure beyond your fondest imagination. You'll be transported miraculously back to the enchanted land of Oz, that magical kingdom beloved by young and old for generations.
It's just a yellow brick.
No, Bellina, you don't understand. This was the yellow brick road.
You'll share with Dorothy Gale the shock of finding everything mysteriously changed.
What's happened to everybody?
And you'll delight with her discovery of 4 wonderful new friends who band together against a wicked queen and the dreaded Nome King. This is the Oz you haven't seen before, and this is the Oz you'll want to visit again and again. From Walt Disney Pictures comes a whole new world of entertainment.
Why don't we just fly back to Kansas?
Return to Oz.
So Return to Oz came out June 21st, 1985, directed and co-written by Walter Murch, which we should note this is his only feature film directorial effort, but he's had a lot of experience prior to this as an editor and a sound guy, where he had worked on stuff like THX 1138, the Godfather movies, The Conversation, had won an Oscar for sound and editing for Apocalypse Now prior to this, and he apparently decided to come on to this after he'd had a meeting with Disney, who, keep in mind, like I kind of referenced this earlier, but Disney had the copyright for another Oz adaptation, because back in like the 50s, Walt had tried to do a movie called The Rainbow Road to Oz, which would have starred a bunch of the Mouseketeers, like the original cast of Mouseketeers, and apparently like that all fell apart. And it never got made, but they still had that copyright in like the early 80s. Apparently, Murch was a big fan of the Oz books when he was a kid, and he decided to, really make something a bit more faithful than the 1939 version. There had been other Oz movies even before the 1939 movie, of course, some silent films and stuff. So he made this movie, which apparently had like such a weird production because it went through like multiple different regimes at Disney, to the degree that, like, it didn't come out until the Eisner-Katzenberg era where they were like, we don't know what to do with this. We're just going to kind of flop it out. And it didn't do very well at the time. And it was very much criticized for being very scary and very frightening and very upsetting, despite being ostensibly aimed at children. Yeah, it's an odd duck, this movie.
Everything you just said, though, is very much true, I would say. Like, this movie is very weird and unsettling in so many ways. I like the kind of contrast that this has with the original Wizard of Oz, which is like that movie is very beautiful and ornate, and everything is like the most gorgeous sets and costumes that you've ever seen, and very lavish. But this is very dark and like dilapidated, and everything's like crumbling and falling apart, and it has a very interesting kind of aesthetic as opposed to the 1939 film, which I think does help it, because I think, like, as we'll talk about later, when Disney does another version of this, it doesn't go well when it kind of is worshipping that original 1939 version.
As much as you legally can.
Right, exactly, yeah. But yeah, I mean, I had not seen this movie before.
Right.
And, I'd heard things, I'd seen kind of some of the creature designs and stuff like that, and I just wasn't prepared for how just strange this movie is. I mean, like, everything about this movie is weird. Every, like, creature and everything is so weird and, like, very creepy and very unsettling. Like, I definitely understand why it scared young children.
Or even, like, before we get to any of the creature stuff, like, the opening of this movie, she's in Kansas, and supposedly it takes place about 6 months after the tornado happened. And so she's going off about Oz, and Aunt Em and Uncle Henry are, like, trying to rebuild the house, but Uncle Henry seems in a very desolate state, and he, like, very much leans on, like, oh, I broke my leg, and there are kind of hints of, like, maybe he's just, like, too depressed to even bother finishing the house. And Aunt Em is like, oh, I don't know what we're gonna do with her, maybe we should try this doctor. So they take Dorothy to a psychiatrist who is very instrumental in, like, oh, we want to experiment on her with shock therapy.
Right, but presenting it as like, it's gonna be 1900, it's a new age where, this is new technology we're exploring here. Like, it's that kind of thing. It's such an interesting sort of way to set up this movie. And it's also just so depressing.
Yep, incredibly depressing. It's so sad. And poor Fairuza Balk just looks like very much like a child who, like, needs some kind of, like, comfort because she's like, but Aunt Em and Uncle Henry, I went to Oz and look, I found this key that has an O and a Z on top of it, right? And she's like, oh, this poor child. We have to get her electroshocked so she can stop having these fantasies.
Yeah, I mean, and just the setup of that is so already kind of like immediately puts you off of like, oh, this is not going to be the 1939 film at all, right? And I like that it actually doesn't do a thing that another Disney version does, which is the black and white opening, trying to kind of recreate, you know, one of the greatest moments in cinema history, which like makes me weep every time I see it still. I like that it is more grounded and not trying to just be, you know, because this is what, 46 years after The Wizard of Oz? Yeah, something like that. So like, yeah, I like that it isn't just kind of being this nostalgia, you know, just of the original, but it also is just so kind of disorienting where you're like, oh, I thought this was like a fun movie that has like, you know, it's about another world of wonder and all of this stuff. And it's a weird setup for this movie.
Obviously, that also messed with me when I was younger, because the thing is, I saw this as a child, not when it originally came out, but I remember, because I was so obsessed with The Wizard of Oz, my dad at one point, like, took me to Blockbuster, and it's like, oh, look, there's another Oz movie. You might like this. He had, of course, no idea, because you look at the poster for this movie, it looks like fun and jovial, like, oh, they're all, like, flying in the air, and it's all
it's a great poster.
Right, characters and stuff like that. It'll be totally fine for a kid. And then I watched it, and there's a specific sort of moment, like, I was already, like, off kilter by, like, oh, yeah, Dorothy, for one thing, is not a 15-year-old pretending to be a 9-year-old. It's an actual 9-year-old girl with Fairuza Balk. Right. But also, like, the aesthetic's very different, and we're introduced to, like, oh, we're going to go back to the Yellow Brick Road in the Emerald City, but, oh, wait, the Yellow Brick Road is dilapidated, and then Emerald City is in ruins, and all of our favorite characters, like, but specifically the Cowardly Lion and the Tin Man, are stone now. All the residents of the Emerald City have been turned to stone. The Scarecrow's gone, and it's like, oh, okay. Where are the songs? Why aren't they singing?
Yeah, it's not a musical, and like even the transition from like Kansas to Oz, which like in like I said, it's that iconic shot from like the original Wizard of Oz, and in this it is a lot more just like she arrives and is like, I think we're in Oz, but this doesn't look like what I remember. This is a lot weirder. This is different. And there isn't that same kind of, like, sense of wonder in the sense of, like, oh, look at this beautiful new place. Oh, my gosh. It is just, like, look at this place. It's in ruins. And it's, like, falling apart.
Yeah, and even, like, the characters that we know are very different. Where, like, the versions of the Cowardly Lion, right, you see in stone and the Tin Man as well. And I think, like, I watched an interview with Murch where he kind of explained why he felt ultimately people didn't really respond to it as well. In The Wizard of Oz, there's, because of, like, the songs and the fact that you have, like, humans in the roles of, like, the Scarecrow and the Tin Man, like, more humanoid bodies. It's like, oh, this is a bit more of, like, a facade, and it's kind of, like, a bit more pretend.
Right.
Versus, like, you have an actual 9-year-old girl interacting with, like, these animatronics and creatures that are not humanoid, really, in the slightest. Even when they have humans inside of them, like, controlling them. It's like, oh, it's like TikTok, where it's like a guy who's, like, basically, like, curved over inside of that body.
Yeah, yeah, because he's, like, I was like, there has to be a person in there, but how does it work? Because he's, like, it's not like R2-D2, where you could, like, you know, fit someone in there. Like, it's someone curled up in a ball, and it looks so uncomfortable. And then same with, like, the Wheelers, which, like, that also just looks like such an uncomfortable, like, costume to have to act in with, like, having wheels for hands.
Yeah, and particularly the main Wheeler guy, who I want to shout out, because he was also, like, a trained mime who basically taught everybody who was, like, in a suit how to, like, do sort of, like, big exaggerated movements to make it seem like these suits were alive. His name's Pons Mar. He talked about the fact that, like, when you have some of these, like, sort of a mix of this puppetry and these actual people in suits, you gotta have to, like, train, basically, these people to, like, realize that, like, oh, okay, I have to move in a different way. Like, the Wheelers, he was like, oh, yeah, basically, in order to move around like that, you have to use all the muscles you don't use to normally walk as a person. And stuff like that, which is crazy to think. And that's what makes it all feel kind of unnatural. Like, particularly the Wheelers, young me, terrified, horrifying creatures.
Yeah, it's that face that you see, which is like their helmet, I guess.
Yeah.
It is, and you see it like around a corner, like that. You know, it's so creepy. I can't imagine watching this movie as a kid because it would have scared the shit out of me. Like,
truly, but I still remember at the same time, despite being scared by this movie, I was also deeply fascinated by it. And I think a big reasoning why, I just got to say, like, this movie was nominated for visual effects, lost to Cocoon, you know, natural, but at the same time, like, I remember when I was a kid, I was just fascinated by, like, all of these different creatures. I think it's one of the underrated, like, practical effects movies to me. Which is the way that you have, like, especially the differentiation between, like, a TikTok, a Jack Pumpkinhead, the Gump, and all these other things. It's such weird fucking creature. Even, like, Belinda the chicken is, like, mostly animatronic when you see it. And it's astonishing.
I mean, yeah, this is the thing of, like, part of me is like, oh my god, what the hell am I watching right now? Because it's so weird. But, like, TikTok, who is my favorite character of like all the kind of side characters, is so, like, you get a lot of close-ups of him, like my background, which is like the when they first meet in that, like, secret room, and you're just like, oh, okay, this, you know, it's an animatronic, whatever. And then you just see like when they get to Mombi, is that her name?
Yeah,
Princess Mombi, when they get to that castle and you see him, like, walking in the background, and you're like, oh wow, this is like a full suit that they have, like, built. And it looks incredible. Like, it doesn't look like a costume. It looks like a real a stubby metal man walking around.
Right, because you have at least the somewhat human movements of, like, his legs, which actually have, like, the person, like, moving around in them. But you have his little arms that could only be done, like, radio controlled, and then especially his face with, like, I love that the mustache moves as, like, his lips.
It's my favorite thing about him. I love that his mustache moves every time. I also love this shot of it's his, like, cap that he, like, kind of, like, can, like, take it off and on. Like, he
like doffs it to Dorothy. Yes. And I think what makes this movie work a lot more, and why I still personally think it's a great movie, is the fact that, like, a Fairuza Balk, who I know you're not as big on child actors necessarily, usually, but I think she does a great job of being genuinely empathetic to these, like, weird monster creature guys who are, like, misunderstood. Nobody just, you know, she realizes that, like, they need some kind of, like, love and protection. Like, I love the bit when the whole action thing with TikTok, where, like, he has a wind up for his action and a wind up for his thinking, and that's how he's able to, like, move around. And there's a point where he realizes, like, oh, I can't move, as, like, they're at Mombi's place, and Dorothy's about to be, like, put up in that tower and implied to be like, oh, I'm going to keep you up there until you're age appropriate for me to slice off your head so I can put it as part of my collection. And she's, like, you know, being dragged away, and TikTok can't move, and he's like, oh, I'm sorry, Dorothy, I can't do it. And she's like, it's all right, TikTok, nothing can be done of it. I just like that. She's understanding of, like, this guy can't move. She's not like angry toward him because of it.
Right. And, like, it's an interesting kind of contrast of, like, you have Dorothy being very sweet and very nice to these, like, these creatures that, like, even as you kind of get used to seeing them, you're just kind of like, oh my god, what is this thing? But, like, I love, like, when she meets, like, Pumpkinhead, and, like, when she puts him back together with, like, the arm and everything, and, like, it's a really sweet moment where she gets to, like, be nice with these, like, creatures, but also, like, you get to see just the effects of these creatures. Like, I love, like, when Pumpkinhead, like, his arm, the way his arm like attaches and she puts it back, and just all of that stuff, which is there's an incredible amount of just tactility to it, which is just, it kind of makes it more unsettling too, is that there is a lot of tactility to it.
Right. But even the fact that, like, when in that sequence where Jack, like, initially stands up, it's a puppet, like, standing up and barely being able to move, and then when he's actually walking around, there's a person actually inside of him. But at the same time, the movement is still seamless enough to where it's like, nope, that's this fucking Pumpkinhead guy just got up, this pile of sticks and a jack-o'-lantern just got up and is walking around.
But I mean, like, the chicken as well, which is such a weird addition to this movie, but is like you see it at first and you can be fooled for just being like, oh, that's a regular chicken, but then yeah, the transition from the actual chicken, I can't believe I'm saying this, to like the animatronic is so like it's seamless. Like if you're not looking for it like me, like I couldn't tell which scenes were a real chicken and which was just an animatronic, because it's very lifelike in a very weird way, where like the mouth is moving and the blinking and everything. It's so insane.
Yeah, and I'm curious, how did you feel about then Bulk with like this movie, especially considering this is her first movie she's ever done, and she's gone on to be in other things. She's in The Craft and stuff like Bad Lieutenant, Port of Call, New Orleans, as well. But how do you feel about her here? Because, like I said, you're not a huge child actor fan generally.
I mean, it can be very hit or miss, but I tend to find kids very annoying in a lot of movies. But no, I mean, like, it's a very difficult performance to do, because you're not acting with people. You're acting with, like, you're not acting with people, and you're not, like, you mentioned, like, The Wizard of Oz has, the 1939 film has, like, the Scarecrow and everyone they look like people in costumes. But it's so, I imagine it's so difficult with, like, just these creatures, these animatronics, and she does a really great job at being, like, it's a great version of Dorothy, from, like, to kind of base it off of, like, Judy Garland's performance. But, like, I think she does a great job, and I think you feel the, like, humanity and the, like, yeah, just her, like, sweetness to these characters is really palpable when, like, she's acting with, like, the TikTok. He's just a stubby C-3PO. Like, it's a really great performance, though, and I think it doesn't really fall into any of those traps that I generally find annoying, which I think is generally, like, precocious children, which is a really kind of welcoming thing for this movie, because it is just so weird.
Yeah, I think some of that, upsetting stuff that we got early on, I think helps feed into, like, her sort of issues with, like, her performance in general, because, like, so much of the earlier stuff is her, like, interacting with humans and having a distance versus her, like, like, when she's talking to Belina, the chicken, before she's ever able to talk or anything like that, she seems to have much more of a natural back and forth, once again, with a thing that doesn't talk and isn't that humanoid. And I think that really works, that kind of, like, awkwardness around other humans makes it, once she ends up, like, in Oz, where it's pretty important to point out that, like, all of the humanoid creatures in Oz are villains. You have the Wheelers, you have Mombi, you have the Nome King. They are all villains who are out to get her, versus the circular, the spherical C-3PO guy is, like, someone that she has much more empathy for. Like, near the end of the movie, when she just, like, hugs him and he cries, it's, like, so sweet and so investing. And she, once again, she can make you believe that, like, I am so invested in this fucking robot man with his mustache.
Yeah, and I mean, like, it's a weird thing, I think, with TikTok specifically, like, because he is a robot, and yet, like, he has a lot of weirdly expressiveness to him in a lot of ways, right? Like, he is a character, and it's a very difficult thing to, like, one, make him feel like a character, because he's a robot man, and having him and Dorothy's relationship, it's a very interesting thing that this movie pulls off with its visual effects, which are, like, really impressive. And especially, like, one we haven't talked about yet is the rock face, not the Nome King, but the rock that has a face on it.
Right, there's sort of, like, a henchman of the Nome King that sort of, like, pop up and have, like, shout out to Will Vinton, great stop motion guy, the guy who created the, like, M&M's ads that we see currently.
Oh, okay.
Like, his studio was initially responsible for that, and he did a lot of other great claymation stuff. But yeah, I just love the expressiveness of those faces, like when they report to the Nome King, and it's like, "Sir, Dorothy's here, and she has a chicken," and stuff like that. It's such a weird, like, very angular mouth movements.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's one of those things, and, like, I mean, the first time you see it, you're just like, oh, the rock has a face on it. Okay. And yeah, every time you see him report where it's like that red like wall, it's so creepy, but yet like really, really fascinating to look at, because it's like, how did they do this? Like, it's, it's the kind of thing with all these visual effects where you're just like, oh wow, there's so much craft put into this, where like obviously this is all pre like digital and CGI, that like it is like so impressive, the craft that goes into just like making the face of that rock look really interesting. And I loved when he popped up again and had to report to the Nome King that the fucking like chicken was in the mountain or something. Like, yeah.
And I forgot until I rewatched it this time that they kind of set that up earlier with like the Nome King is played by Nicole Williamson, who also appears as the psychiatrist earlier. And there's the bit where he introduces, like, during that psychiatrist stuff, like, he introduces Dorothy to the electroshock machine. And he says, look, it has a face on it. It's got these two eyes. And there's, like, sort of ease her into, like, hey, we're going to use this to shock you so you stop having fantasies about us. And it's, like, kind of, like, laying the groundwork for later on we have rocks that have faces and all this other, like, weird shit.
Right. Again, it does feel like a moment of, like, I was a kid who, like, hated going to the doctor. And, like, the getting shots. It does feel, that feels like a genuine moment of, like, a doctor trying to calm her down of, like, look, it has a face. But, like, that doesn't help. It has a face.
It makes it even worse, honestly, because it's like, oh, this thing is sentient and it wants to, like, hurt me.
It's when he, like, moves the thing and he's like, and what's this? It's his tongue. And I'm like, that is really creepy. Please stop doing that.
For sure. But, I mean, we should talk about our villains a bit. Because I think the villains that we have, we mentioned the Wheelers, who are all, like, upsetting. Even when they die, which is another, like, great upsetting bit of this movie, when, like, they go into the deadly desert, and you see that, like, oh, if you touch the sand, you become sand and, like, crumble away.
It's a really great effect, though, when they, like, crumble into the sand. Like, it's like a sand castle, like, falling apart. I love it.
Yes, but we also have Mombi, who is played by Jean Marsh, at least in her normal form that is, like, through most of the movie, who also plays the nurse that we see earlier, who's also wearing, like, an upsetting, just, like, her dress even looks, like, gothic in a really upsetting way, like in the other version. But also a shout out to Sophie Ward and Fiona Victory, who play two other heads that, like, Mombi wears at a certain point. This was the thing I remember that gave me nightmares as a child, Mombi, who is, like, such an upsetting character, admittedly, because it's like, oh, when you introduce her as, oh, she's, like, sort of a version of, like, Glinda or whatever, right? She's gonna be, like, a good witch, maybe, who they encounter. It's like, oh, and you learn real quick, like, nope, she's not. Because she's like, oh, here, let me show you my gallery of heads as I place one on my shoulders and my body is headless briefly. But yeah, it's such a great example of, like, that's an amazing effect too. Like, the body and, like, all the different heads that are in the cabinet displays. It feels truly like movie magic stuff.
Yeah. And especially, like, it's the shot when she's holding the head. What do you think of, like, all my heads? Or she says something like that, and it's just a like thing of, like, oh wow, yeah, it's movie magic. It's like, how did they do that? How did they create this shot? It looks so weird, and like, yeah, even her just, like, putting the head on, like the Darth Vader helmet is, it's one of those, like, movie magic moments of, like, just, like, especially, like, 80s visual effects where you're just like, it's creepy, but it is so, like, fascinating to look at and, like, to figure out how it's going on and how it's working.
Like, even now, I can kind of see it where it's like, oh, all these cabinets are, like, women that are just, like, putting their heads out while their bodies are, like, probably, like, behind this, like, curtain that's there or whatever. But it still just feels so seamless, and especially the bit where Dorothy's, like, sneaking around trying to find the little life powder thing, and then she wakes up the Jean Marsh head, and she just starts bellowing, like, Dorothy Gale, and then her headless body rises up out of her bed.
Yeah, it's so creepy. And yet, like, I love the design of her castle, which is, like, ornate, but, like, in this weird, like, crumbling kind of way. Like, everything's kind of falling apart, but it is still this very beautiful, like, palace. And, like, that hallway specifically of, like, where all the heads are is, like, incredible.
And all the mirrors and stuff like that, yeah, which we should say, it's not technically her palace, because we do kind of get hints that she maybe took this from somebody else, and we see a little ghost girl in a mirror, another very charming image that wouldn't terrify a child, like at all. But yeah, I love her in particular, where she has this sort of like false regality that makes it seem like, oh, I'm the sort of queen of this particular dilapidated area who like bosses around wheelers, and I love uses them as like a big chariot, like when she goes through her tunnel and shit. It's so cool.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and I love her performance as well, because it is very, again, and in this movie, like, despite all the creepiness and stuff, that aside, like, it isn't doing the 1939 version. And I like her performance because, yeah, it feels like it feels very nuanced, and also just she's very menacing. Like, she's just very, like, so menacing. And like, even as the nurse, like that like black dress she's wearing, where it's like it looks like a funeral like dress or something, is like very menacing. And the way she talks to like Dorothy at the beginning is like, yeah, it just, she's a scary woman.
But there's also a sense of desperation there, which I like. Like,
Yeah.
especially when Dorothy isn't around after a certain point, which is like, you gotta chase after him. It feels less like a, like, because obviously Margaret Hamilton is the Wicked Witch in the original movie. One of the great, like, evil kid movie performances of any sort. There's a reason why she also terrified children for, like, decades afterward. But it's a very different performance where she's very confident, and there's, like, no sort of bluster at all in her performance. Like, no, I'm gonna get this kid, and I'm gonna like put her up in my tower, and she's gonna not be a threat to me whatsoever. Versus Mombi has an inherent like, oh fuck, I gotta like get this kid back, or else everything's like screwed, because of course she's under the Nome King, who is just another brilliant sort of like meld of like Nicole Williamson's performance sometimes, where like initially he's stop motion when we see him, great stop motion for him,
Yeah.
and
Oh,
then
yeah.
and then gradually as like he sort of becomes more human, it turns into Nicole Williamson and all this great, like, elaborate makeup.
There we go.
Yeah, he just changed his background, everybody, listening to Nicole Williamson version of that character. And I like the fact that with him, he also has a lot more of, like, a manipulative vibe that I think is even a bit different from, like, any of the other sort of villains we've had in, like, The Wizard of Oz, where, like, there's a point after, like, the setup is that all these different people who Dorothy has encountered, brought along on her journey, have to go into this big ornament room and try and see if they can locate the Scarecrow in there, and they have to touch an object and say Oz, and then he'll like pop up instead of being an object anymore. And there's a point where it's just Dorothy and him, and he's like, why did you come all this way for like a Scarecrow? It feels like this is just like a bad dream for you, right? You can leave. I have the ruby slippers on,
Right.
which he wears those ruby slippers very well. He's very protective of them because stylishly
like-
looks perfect.
The way they poke out under his like little robe when he's like, look, my ruby slipper. It's really funny.
Yeah, even like, shout out to whoever did that feet acting. Incredible. Where it's just like, right here, look. Oh, it's like almost displaying them like that. But he gives Dorothy an out of just like, I can send you back home and you don't have to ever think of this place again. And it's like this great sort of devil temptation thing that also provides like that kind of difference that you're talking about from The Wizard of Oz. Where it's like, he gives her a way out. It's not like you're going to be stuck in here forever. It's like, you can leave. Just, you won't mess with me ever again.
And I do like, though, the way that this kind of like this set piece in particular very much like, at least initially, kind of mirrors when they first get to the Emerald City in The Wizard of Oz, and they meet Oz with his like the light show and all that stuff. There's the stuff where the Nome King is like pointing and like fires coming out of like the hole, and like also have to mention that the doorway they go into is like the rock hands like pulling the rocks apart, kind of.
Yes.
Like, it looks really, really great. But yeah, I love the way that it mirrors that, and yet there is that sort of like sinister like thing where he's like, basically he's like, I'm gonna kill all your friends first and then you. But yeah, he gives her that like kind of out, but it's very menacing and it's very weird, and his design is maybe the creepiest thing in this movie to me, in my opinion. Like, it's especially the close-ups when he's like smoking his like pipe is like so creepy and so weird, because he's like, I don't know, just the texture on his face where he's like rock texture kinda, it really creeped me out a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. Though I would say the creepiest thing to me, even now, so beyond Mombi or Nome King. All respect to my main man from the first movie, but in this movie, the Scarecrow looks like terrifying. And he's like, in theory, the least terrifying, because it's very close to like the illustrations if you look at the old L. Frank Baum books. It looks very close to that design. But just the fact that like he has like his eyes and his mouth that like sometimes move, but sometimes they don't, depending on the shot. It's very unsettling.
Right, and he's got like his head is like it's clearly like some sort of like helmet type of thing going on.
Right.
But his eyes are like very wide. It reminds me of like a, I don't know, some sort of costume at like a theme park where it's like, oh, this is kind of unsettling and creepy, even though it's supposed to be this like, hey, here's the Scarecrow from the movie. Like you know, you love him.
Kind of like if you see the modern Mickey Mouse now that does actually like blink and it's his mouth moves.
Right. Yes.
Really weird.
Yeah, and like it's a weird thing where like especially comparing the Scarecrow to like from the original Wizard of Oz, where it looks like a person who like that is like an effect or like a makeup from that movie that still I look at that and I'm like, wow, this looks like incredible. I think that like original Scarecrow looked really wonderful, and what they've done to him here is just so creepy and weird. And his crown, which is kind of like it's like bent at the ends. It's very like
right, almost looks like it exploded from something.
Right.
Yeah. And I think it's a big credit to also the fact like with a lot of these creatures that we see, it's a lot of like there's somebody sort of in a suit, but there's also people off to the side doing like the sort of like radio controlled stuff. Like I watched a behind the scenes doc that was from around the time. And you see a lot of people just like radio controls moving around, so like the the eyebrows move and then like the mouth can move and stuff like that. Which one of those guys is Brian Henson, who directed our previous film,
right?
Who is the guy who does the head puppetry and also does the voice of Jack Pumpkinhead. Which is like apparently he was like 20 years old doing this. This is his first like thing not attached to like anything his father did previously, sort of job. And I love his sort of like weird demeanor as Jack, where he feels like sort of he's a massive tall guy, but he's a child. In particular, that he calls Dorothy Mom. It's kind of sweet, even though it's also incredibly sad, because it's like, oh, my other mom disappeared somewhere, so can you be my mom, even if it isn't true?
Yeah, it's very like sweet and innocent, and yet, like a lot of this movie is a little like weird and a bit like off kilter, and yeah, like what he asks her, like, I don't know where my mom is. Can I call you mom, even though you're not my mom? It's really sweet.
And I like also that he's expressive, but like his mouth never moves, but he still has like expression in his head. Like there are certain points where his head will like kind of morph upward when like he's excited. Yeah. That effect is amazing to make like the head even like squash and stretch like that.
Yeah, he's got like a really long like neck too. It's like really like a skinny neck too, where like it was a thing where I was trying to figure out like how is there has to be a person in there, but like how it's. Yeah, it's a really interesting, like, this movie, I think, exists in a really interesting, like, time when, like, visual effects are really, like, just, like, the craft is really there, and there's a lot of, like, that exploring of, like, how can we do all of these weird effects with these, practical elements, because we have to do it practically, and, yeah, it's such an impressive thing about this movie, while also being creepy.
Yeah, shout out to Lyle Conway, who is was the guy who like designed all the puppets and various different creatures, and also a year after this would do the effects work for Little Shop of Horrors, which I think is where you get. Right. That's where I think the sort of the way these characters feel so lifelike, it really works. And he also does a lot of the animatronic stuff and the voice of the Gump, who we haven't really talked about, but I do love. It's just like this creature that they create so they can escape. That is like this deer-like head that's mounted on the wall that they put onto a sofa that has like wings in the form of like palm leaves and then a broom for a tail. And he's just like, oh, looks like I'm alive. I don't know how long I can stay together though.
Right. And they even seem to not entirely be sure like what he is necessarily. Like they're kind of, I don't know, I feel like it feels like they treat him like a friend, obviously, but they are kind of just like, yeah, we made you. Like you're hello. Like
Well, yeah, there's literally a point where, like, the Gump asks, like, what am I? And Dorothy says, like, you're just a thing.
Yeah. It's so weird. And, like, it's just, I mean, the logic of him where, like you said, that's how they built him. And then that's why they need the powder of life. Is that what it's called?
Right.
Which they pour it on him and he comes to life. And
Well, she has to say the magic words that are on the back of the directions, which I also love.
Yes. Yeah, and it's very weird and so, but I think I like that sort of like fantasy kind of childhood logic, right? Like which it has, right? Which is like, yeah, you put a head on a thing, give him some arms, and then you created a thing, right? It's like it's a really wonderful in its logic, but it like everything else it's weird and unsettling, and like he is like every time you see him, it's very creepy.
But I think that adds something also to, like, something that, like, I heard Murch talk about when he was doing this interview that I watched. He did such a great job of explaining that, like, I think that just adds that sort of, like, all these elements that we're talking about of, like, all the unsettling nature of it and the weird kind of, like, slapdash child logic. It adds kind of this nature of, like, we're not talking down to, like, kids when we have
Right.
them do any of these things. And even, like, that the stakes of it being as like high as they are makes it a lot more investing, because like if you're watching these other Oz things, a lot of it feels like it's just kind of like aping on a worse version of the Margaret Hamilton Wicked Witch character with the villains, and it feels like there aren't really any stakes actually there. We're just kind of like going on an adventure and there's vague threat but not really any threat, as opposed to this movie, because everything feels so like real but also creepy, it makes you feel more invested to where it's like, Dorothy's got to get out of this shit. This world is out to get her. She needs to get the hell out of here.
But I love it because it gives her stakes in terms of, like, she has to save her friends, right? Like, she has to stay to save her friends, but she also really wants to get the fuck out of here because it's, like, everything is, like, horrible. And I really do love the side, like, because I was initially hesitant with the beginning section of this movie with her and like the hospital and stuff. I don't know, it as much as I say that I don't want a movie to just sort of ape on the nostalgia of the 1939 film, I did feel like I missed the kind of the wonder and the beauty that was there. But I love the idea of her returning to Oz and not finding it obviously how she was there last, and having to kind of save it, but not necessarily save it in this like massive kind of thing, like an Oz the Great and Powerful, which we'll get to that a little bit later. But
we'll get to that.
But it is like, it's an interesting sort of the way that the movie kind of makes her go on this journey of like having to save Oz, but yeah, it's an interesting. I'm interested in that, even though, it's very kind of disorienting at first to kind of get into this world that is very much different than like the 39 version, obviously. But yeah, it works. It absolutely works, and you feel like just the stakes of it. You feel like the tension of it, like just throughout the whole thing. It's yeah.
Well, it also helps that, like, that earlier stuff, as I grow older, I realize how, like, integral that is to kind of setting up the dilapidated version of Oz. Is not too dissimilar from, like, Kansas in her world, where it's like, oh, we're trying to, like, come back out of this horrible tornado that happened and trying to rebuild our home, but we're all in this kind of, like, depressive state. It feels like it's this weird parallel, and especially even, like, how the Nome King does that whole thing of, like, you can forget all about Oz and go back home, is very reflective of like Nicole Williamson's other character is like, we want to get rid of your fantasies so that doesn't bother you here in the real world. The movie's basically mainly about how Dorothy has to realize that like, my dreams are integral for me to like live. My imagination, my sense of wonder is integral to making my real humdrum life. For it to survive and thrive, I have to have a bit of that like imagination and that wonder at the same time, especially like as a kid, she has to be able to have that. And obviously, seeing this 9-year-old girl go through all this is traumatic to like, especially when I was watching this at like a younger age than even her. It's like, oh fuck, this is a kid having to do all this shit. It feels like, once again, the stakes are so high with that, but at the same time, it makes like that eventual ending where she gets to have like her happy home, and Aunt Em and Uncle Henry aren't fucking depressed as hell. It's all because like she is kind of like almost this like guiding light for them, because she has that jovial childhood wonder still, because she saved all her friends and us.
Yeah. I was a bit weary going into this, into the ending of this, when, like, after they save Oz and defeat the Nome King, of, like, oh, are they going to do a thing where, like, she gets to stay in Oz and, like, rebuild Oz with all her friends? And no, like, I like that. I like that it still hinges on her wanting to go home, which is, like, it's such a beautiful little sentiment, and, like, I love that she, gets to go home, but isn't forgetting her, like, that childhood imagination. Like you said, it really lands, I think, which I was a bit nervous about going into it.
Yeah, because, like, I've heard that from some people where it's like, oh, in The Wizard of Oz, why does Dorothy even leave Oz and go back to, like, that shitty fucking hellhole of Kansas? Like, why even bother going back? But, yeah, I like the fact that it seems like she wants to spread that kind of empathy that she has for, like, these other creatures to, like, her actual human aunt and uncle. It's her kind of learning to have that kind of empathy for humanoid people after a certain point. But, I mean, there's some other stuff that, before we get too far into the ending, that we haven't talked about, like the whole Nome King unraveling that happens after Dorothy gets in there, realizes his plan, and starts, like, solving it. I love that he has a bit of that confidence, where he's just like, oh, this is a fun game. You know, it's going to be fun for her to do this. And the moment she starts getting shit right, he's like, you let her out. You fucked this up for me, Mombi.
Well, because Mombi comes to him and she's like, you got to deal with her. She's on her way. And he's like, I know. I'm dealing with it. Like, calm down.
Don't worry. Come on. Chill out.
Yeah, I got this. And
like,
then,
you fucked up, but I'm doing great.
Right. And then, she starts to figure it out, and you can see him just get, like, seething, and then he starts, like, just letting it all out, and then he becomes what is Thomas's background, which is a rock lava man thing. I don't know how to describe what he is.
Just this amazing abomination of a thing that just rises up. Especially, I love that too, when, like, this ornate room, which I love the design of that, like, ornament room. And how it looks like just a big, like, fancy room covered in all these different, like, great, like, vases and stuff like that. But then the moment he realizes, like, oh, they're winning my game, I have to completely destroy this room and have, like, hell open up, basically.
Yeah, I mean, all I could think when, like, it showed his mountain, I was like, oh, it's Mount Doom, basically. It's basically Mount Doom. And, he, like, starts to try to eat them.
Initially, Dorothy is like, oh, but you said we solved everything that we could. I'm tired of playing games. And he starts to try and, like, eat Jack. Like, he picks him up, and I love that too, the little animation. But of course, Bellina is inside of Jack's head, which I love that detail. And, like, she hid inside, because there's this whole recurring thing of, like, the chicken. The chicken is, like, the key to all of this, evidently.
Yeah, oh my god, there's a chicken? What? Like, it's...
Right, they set that up a lot, and it's like, I wonder what's the reasoning, and it's just Bellina, like, inside of Jack's head, is, like, so scared that she lays an egg, for the first time in a while, apparently, based on the earlier Oz stuff, and the egg falls into the Nome King's mouth, and it makes him crumble. Apparently he has a severe egg allergy of some sort.
Look, as someone who's lactose intolerant, I get it. He's just like me for real, but...
Right, I mean, if you ate an egg, you would also, like, crumble like this. Like, if I had dinner with you and you ate an egg, it would just be like, eggs are poison, and then your eyes glaze over.
I would just repeat poison over and over again.
And I'm like, check, please.
I mean, it is like the water from, like, the original Wizard of Oz, right? Where it is just this, like, weird thing of, like, oh, water's the solution? Okay. But it's so, like... It never feels like it's out of place necessarily in this movie, which is so strange and so bizarre, where you're like, oh, of course, the egg is poison and it killed him. Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
And especially the way he crumbles apart is also, like, once again, it's our villain being defeated, but it's not just the Wicked Witch, I'm melting, what a world. Right. It's like, this guy fucking, like, decomposes in front of them. And especially I love his little minions who are claymation start coming up, and it's like, oh, were they going to attack? And it's like, oh, no. oh no, he's gonna die, and then they also like shrivel away.
Yeah. But I love his design at the end. Like here, I love the animation, which is just it's like great, like stop motion animation. It's so weird and so interesting to look at. And this whole segment is just like, what the hell is happening?
Truly, yes. And it's so interesting, especially when you consider like all this stuff that's happened, like all of this like horror that we get like throughout this movie. And then the movie ends with like a great parade where like they go through Oz and everyone's happy, everyone's back. It's great.
Yeah.
It's like almost like the Don Bluth or like 80s kids movie style thing. This happens a lot where it's like, oh, all these horrible things happen to our little kid protagonist, but he got out of it, so happy ending, everyone's great.
Right. It's very funny the way that this movie, obviously, like, because in her departure, she, like, says bye to everyone, like, TikTok and everyone. And then, like, I like the way that, like, the Cowardly Lion is, like, handled, where, like, he's almost an afterthought, even though, like, Dorothy has this, like, previous kind of connection to him, but we can't reference that necessarily, but, like, yeah, I like the way that this kind of whole segment feels, and I love the design of this, like, I don't know, like the palace that they're at. It's gorgeous, and I love like all the citizens of Emerald City, the way that like their costumes and everything. Yeah, just really incredible.
Yeah, there are a few that kind of look like the earlier movie, which if I had any criticism about this movie is that like I wish it went full stop into we're not gonna reference the stuff from the earlier movie, because it's kind of like a weird half and half sequel. Because especially like the ruby slippers is a great example of that, because in the book it's the silver slippers, and they had to literally like pay MGM a fee to get like the ruby slippers in there, and I almost wish they stuck with like the silver slippers, because having ruby, it draws more attention to like, oh yeah, the classic ruby slippers that we knew previously, and even like the close-ups of Dorothy with the slippers on, having to click her heels and stuff like that. I think if they just got rid of those few little mentions, I think it would be a lot less sort of like tied in some people's mind to like that original movie. Right.
Also, another Oz movie I watched was The Wiz, which that has the silver slippers, which that makes a lot of sense why it was in that one.
Yeah, The Wiz, by the way, I think a much more terrifying movie than this one.
The Wiz, I watched The Wiz today as well, and it's kind of my feelings on it are kind of similar to this, of like the production design and the costume design especially are so incredible and wild in that movie, and so insane. And it's a weird movie. I really like that movie. I don't know how you feel about it though.
I think there's like elements that I really love about it, and then there's stuff that feels like interminable to me. I think particularly like, look, I love Diana Ross, but getting her to play Dorothy, I think, is a weird choice, considering like even in like the Wiz Broadway show, like it's supposed to be a kid, Dorothy, and she's like pushing 40, I think, at that point, and it's like, this is weird.
Yeah, it is weird. I don't know. There's something I really find fascinating about that movie. And it's also it's very weird and interesting to see like Diane Ross and Michael Jackson and like Richard Pryor and Iman all be in this movie. It's a weird movie.
Also, that's directed by Sidney Lumet and written by Joel Schumacher.
Right. It's so bizarre. Yeah, I don't know. I really like it though, but I mainly just think the visuals of it are so interesting and are very, again, like that movie is very separated from like, in some ways separated from like The Wizard of Oz. Right. And it is so like just such a wild contrast to that movie and all the production and everything. Which reminded me of this movie in some ways, just how like, you don't have to adhere necessarily strictly to The Wizard of Oz, even though it is this like monumental film. It's like,
But I mean, that one also I think has a similar kind of like aesthetic it's playing to that's not too dissimilar from The Wizard of Oz in terms of like what I was talking about earlier. Like this is like pretend we're having a big musical, and it's like still supposed to be jovial, even though you have like killer trash cans.
Killer trash cans, killer like subway pillars, which is
right? Yeah.
So crazy. Yeah. And the songs, which I think are I think are written by Quincy Jones.
The newer ones in particular, yeah.
Yeah, which I like some of them, but yeah, that movie's weird, but also has kind of a similar like dilapidated kind of rundown aesthetic, right? Which is kind of again contrasts the more ornate and lavish style of the original, which I find interesting.
Right, it's 70s New York, so
Yeah,
rather similar, yes. But yeah, you know, while we're even talking about that movie, we might as well we've addressed it sometimes, but the most recent Oz movie, Oz the Great and Powerful, which you also watched, apparently.
I did. I didn't see it. I hadn't seen it since I missed it in theaters, and I kind of dreaded watching it a little bit because it's long. It's 2 hours and 10 minutes. I had not heard good things about it, even though it's directed by Sam Raimi, and it's a really bad movie.
Yep.
I mean, I guess if I have anything positive up front to say about it, I think Michelle Williams, shockingly, is great in it, and is an actor who, like, I mean, she's one of my favorite actors, and is so great at being in, like, bullshit, right? Because she's also in, like, Venom.
She delivered the immortal line, "I'm sorry about Venom."
Right, exactly. But she sells it so much, and she's really great in this movie. But I think it's really bad. I mean, just James Franco is maybe the worst casting decision I have ever seen in my life. Like,
Yeah.
I can't think of a worse person to play that character, and his characterization of it is so weird and not great.
Especially when you consider, like, the original idea it was developed as a project for Robert Downey Jr., which makes way more sense.
Way more sense.
Way more sense.
That's great casting.
Right, because you want somebody who's kind of like a fun con man kind of thing. Versus,
Right.
like, if you saw Robert Downey Jr., it's like, I'm instantly charmed. Versus a James Franco, it's like, this guy's skeevy. I don't trust him.
Right, you see right through him. Right, exactly.
Right.
And, like, just the way that the whole movie is about, like, jealous women. Like, really? Like, this is what we're gonna do? This is how we're gonna treat our female characters?
Particularly, like, I would say, like, Mila Kunis is also, I think, an equally terrible casting. But at the same time, unlike a James Franco, I have no empathy for, because he looks like he doesn't give a single fuck about anything. It's really, like, the most apathetic performance I've seen in a movie. Versus Mila Kunis is, like, trying so hard, and it's like, oh,
She is, yeah.
no, this isn't working. Mila, I'm sorry.
And, like, look, I know that this is a movie that was, like, big for 3D, and I clearly didn't see it in 3D, and it is a really bad-looking movie.
Yeah.
It is just really ugly, which is, like, such a shame, because I think Sam Raimi is, of course, a great director, and the movie's shot by Peter Deming, who shot, like, Mulholland Drive and, like, Evil Dead 2, and but it's so hideous, and it, like, it weirdly enough looks like a lot of movies look today. It looks like it was shot in, like, The Volume. It has that, like, really muddy digital, like, thing to it. Zach Braff as the flying monkey character, who looks really bad.
Well, it's a weird movie where, like, the CG looks bad, but also the makeup bits we get, particularly, like, Mila Kunis's version of the witch, where it's like it looks as close as, once again, that movie is trying so hard to be like, we are a sequel to that earlier movie, but we can't legally say it. And, like, all the differences are just enough to make it look uncanny. Like, particularly, the weird thing with, like, her version of the Wicked Witch is, like, she has, like, this puffier design, just because of, like, Kunis's face. And then also she has, like, cleavage. It's so weird.
It's
just
weird.
Like, I don't want to think, like, I don't have the Wicked Witch fetish. I don't know what you're trying to push on me.
Yeah, and, like, there are elements in this movie that are like, oh right, Sam Raimi directed this, where, like, you get those canted angles, you get, like, like, crazy cinematography, like, you know, he does the Raimi cam a few times, but, like, those the elements of it that are Sam Raimi feel very, like, disparate from, like, what The Wizard of Oz is, right? Because, like, I don't know, I don't think of those, like, Sam Raimi's style and The Wizard of Oz they're not in the same, like, conversation, I don't think.
Though I would argue, if you let him do a Return to Oz style movie,
sure, yeah,
I think that would totally fit. Like, if he had done a version of, like, this movie, which, of course, Disney, who made Oz the Great and Powerful as well, it's just like, no, you're not getting anywhere close to that.
Right. but the movie's trying to be this like blockbuster, right? Like it's trying to be like a blockbuster that is a kind of a sequel to The Wizard of Oz. It's very much like using the nostalgia of that movie, but like it's so long, it's so boring, and again, it's just really ugly looking.
Which is what I'm so curious for the next sort of version of Oz we're getting is that Wicked movie. Which
Right.
I've seen the Wicked Broadway show, and that's also a show that tries to sidestep around as much as it can to being like an actual prequel to The Wizard of Oz with like a lot of its design stuff. So I'm very curious how they're going to work with that, and also how, you know, a modern big budget fantasy musical is going to potentially have a lot of these same kind of muddy aesthetics that we're talking about. Even though we're a decade out from Oz the Great and Powerful, it feels like sadly that we're maybe not going to be able to diverge away from that, especially considering it's a two-parter.
Yeah,
Doesn't
yep.
make any fucking sense to me, because that musical should just be like, I don't know, like a 2-hour movie. You can just fit it all in.
Yeah, although it is directed by John M. Chu, so you know, could be interesting. But yeah, I don't really have any. I don't know anything about Wicked really. I think it's never been. You know me. I'm not a big musical theater person, but
Right.
I'm very curious to see how that's gonna do. But yeah, Oz the Great and Powerful is a really bad movie, and again, it's the kind of thing we were talking about of like, you don't have to like, because even that movie makes a lot of like subtle, I'm using air quotes, subtle references to the original, where it's like, oh really, like you're just making that kind of reference to The Wizard of Oz. It's a really bad movie.
I still remember the saddest I've ever like felt for Sam Raimi is there was a bit where someone was talking to him about like the only time I've heard him reference anything about Oz the Great and Powerful post it coming out was he was doing an interview, I think, for the Nerdist podcast, and they brought up Oz the Great and Powerful at some point, and all he had to say was, I did the best I could. That's all he could say. It was such a bummer.
I mean, it is a movie you watch it and you really feel bad for him, because like he really is trying, and there's elements there are certain sequences that like where you wake up where you're like, oh wow, this is like kind of interesting in some way. And I like the sort of like final set piece of that movie being like the whole like, you know, creating the big magic trick and all that stuff, which I kind of like, but it's a really long movie. Yeah. Oh, and I like Bruce Campbell. Bruce Campbell being the guard is funny.
Right.
I guess.
The Winky Guard, it's a funny bit. Yeah.
Yeah.
For sure. But in contrast to someone else we should feel bad for, Walter Murch with this movie. Before we get to final thoughts on Return to Oz, I'm curious, how do you feel about his direction here? Do you think he could have like done other interesting work? Do you wish he had made other movies after Return to Oz?
I do actually, yeah. I mean, the visuals of this movie are really great, like we talked about. I think that comes through with like directing, right? Like I think he's an editor, right? So a lot of the kind of seamlessness of the visual effects, I feel like, are him, right? Like he really does like direct this movie very well. And like this shot, which is like my background right now, which is the kind of shot of the Nome King and Dorothy, is like a really wonderful shot. And there's a lot of like really great matte paintings like early on in the movie and stuff like that. Yeah, I wish he had directed more movies, because like he's also just a great editor. Obviously, he's edited some great movies. He also he edited Tomorrowland, or he was an editor on Tomorrowland.
Right, which part of that interview I saw was him basically being used as a sacrificial lamb for, like, he got fired from it. Disney was unhappy with what was going on with the movie.
Right.
And so they were like, we have to fire somebody to set an example for Bird about what needs to happen. So they got rid of him to show, like, this means business. We're not fucking around. You gotta, like, fix this shit. And keep in mind, that's the only time he's been fired off of a movie as an editor.
Yeah, I mean, like, again, I don't even love Tomorrowland, but that is a really fucked up move, especially for Walt. Like, I mean, that movie came out in 2015. At this point, he's like a legendary, like, figure in cinema. Like, he's edited some of the great movies. Like, that's.
I know, to Disney, he's still the guy who made Return to Oz. And they tried to fire him off this movie. That's a very crucial thing. It's like there was a point where apparently he got kind of sick, and it was at the same time where Disney was like, we don't like this footage. We're going to fire him. So George Lucas and Francis Ford Coppola literally went up to Disney and said, like, don't fire him. Like, we want our friend to have, like, his role, to the degree that, like, Lucas said, like, if you're unsatisfied after he comes back, I'll finish the movie.
Yeah, that sounds really fucked up. And, like, but I mean, I do love Lucas and Coppola kind of coming to his aid, though. That's, like, also keeps in line with, like, them coming to, like, Kurosawa's aid. Like, I love hearing, like, stories about them just, like, using their clout at the time to just, like, help people out.
And George gets a special thanks credit at the end of the credits for this
does he
movie.
really? Oh, that's cool.
I appreciate it, Walter. Thank you.
Because Gary Kurtz also worked on this movie. He was a producer
Right.
on it, and he's also, like, worked with, like, George Lucas and stuff like that. So, yeah, weird, interesting connection to George Lucas.
Yeah, also, TikTok is at the Lucasfilm Ranch.
Really?
He's apparently, like, there's a big garden area, and he's kind of like the central kind of statue piece.
Let's
that's
get
there.
some flights to the...
Oh, look.
I need to go visit my best friend
If anyone
TikTok.
has Lucasfilm, like, connections, we would love to do that tour. We are so down to do that.
I need a picture with my new best friend TikTok. He's great.
You know, in this modern age where kids are obsessed with another TikTok, he's the real TikTok.
That's true. Every time they said, like, TikTok, I kept thinking, like, oh boy, this is so weird to hear this now.
And it was so weird, like, why isn't TikTok flossing? Why isn't he doing TikTok dances? He's clearly so mobile he could do that.
God. That's how Disney brings it back and brings it, like, for the kids is to get TikTok and then make him do some dances.
Sure, because that'll totally work out. It totally will. Put TikTok on TikTok, everybody. But yeah, you know, let's go into our final thoughts then. Any final thoughts, any last minute things you want to mention about Return to Oz, Brian?
Well, one thing we didn't mention really either of the actors who play her Uncle Henry and Aunt Em, who Aunt Em is Piper Laurie, of course,
Yes.
rest in peace. Who of course, like, love her on Twin Peaks.
And
And
Carrie
then-
and all that, yeah.
Right, and then Matt Clark, who I'm not as familiar with, but are you familiar with him? I know he's in Back to the Future 3, but I'm not sure what else he's in.
No, yeah, I'm not as familiar with him, but I do like the two of them. They feel especially that kind of like sadness we got earlier. It feels very like much on their faces, like that earlier scene where she's just talking about like, oh man, I guess we gotta take her over to that doctor, and he's like, why are we taking her to a doctor we can't pay? And the whole conversation about like, oh, my sister's gonna lend it to us, that's charity, all this other stuff.
Right.
It feels like an actual, once again, very sad, like little bit of just like, oh, this family's in desperate needs. Especially the bit where like you see Matt Clark like sitting in the unfinished house, not like moving or anything as they're like leaving. It's like such a bummer.
But the ending when he runs to her and like they hug, and it's a really beautiful moment where they reconnect. And especially with Piper Laurie when she like hugs her, it's such a beautiful moment that like just kind of really nails that like the human elements of the story.
Right. And even like the little coda where we do get a bit of, we haven't mentioned much about Ozma, who's sort of the character we kind of referenced earlier. The Ozma who was in like the books and stuff like that, is like the princess of Oz, who's been kept in like the mirrors, and also plays like the little girl that we see earlier on that gives Dorothy the jack-o'-lantern, which is very cute. Also a very weird thing where like that actress was actually British, and she's dubbed over by Walter Murch's daughter.
Oh,
Who had like
that's sweet.
Right. Emma Ridley is her name, the young actress. But yeah, like that whole thing where she even like comes out like at the very end of when she's in Oz before she sends Dorothy off, just like, you can come back to Oz anytime you want. I'll keep an eye on you. And then she shows up at the mirror at the end, which is a sweet little bit.
Right.
And it's just like, oh no, don't tell Aunt Em that I'm here. And then like she takes the mirror down and stuff like that. And then Dorothy gets to have, you know, some fun outside with Toto, who's also here. Which we should mention, like, Toto was, like, teased at the beginning. And it's like, no, Toto doesn't go on this adventure. He gets to stay behind and howl sadly as Dorothy goes off to the hospital. I like that little ending that feels, once again, like this is the happy ending earned. Like, she gets to be a kid who gets to go out and, like, play with her goddamn dog outside. And, like, the house is actually finished and everything. It feels like life moves on in Kansas. But at the same time, she has that connection to Oz still. I like that kind of
Right.
there's a bit more of like a balance in her life.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, again, like I said earlier, like it is that thing of like she has to go home, right? Like that is like, it has to happen, but like it also just for me, like I like that it is her like not forgetting, right? Like that sort of scene in the mirror is like her not, like she's gonna move on and like life goes on, like you said, but like she will remember Oz and her friends and her time there and the lessons we learned along the way, etc., etc., which I love.
Right. And once again, that happy ending is so much more earned because we went through hell earlier. We literally went to the bowels of Nome King's hell and got out of it. Also, another shout out for something like David Shire does the score for this movie. It's a beautiful score. I love how like lush, and it kind of goes from being like tragic and upsetting to like very beautiful, and has that kind of ennui that really makes sense for this movie. It's a wonderful score.
Yeah. Hell yeah. I agree.
But yeah, you know what? Let's go into final thoughts, Brian. Final thoughts on Return to Oz.
Yeah, I mean, look, this is the Atypical episode, and this is a very strange movie that I literally didn't really know anything about it going into it, other than it was a real messed up movie. But I mean, it is a very dark and very strange movie, and yet like there is that humanity there that we've talked about throughout the entire movie, and I think like Fairuza Balk, like her performance at the core of this is really important and is very good, and just the way that she has to act against all of these animatronics and people in suits and all of that stuff is great. And I mean, the visual effects of this thing are really incredible. I mean, like once you get past the very unsettling nature of like a lot of these designs, you just start to look at them and go like, oh my god, these are incredible creations, and there's incredible craft here, and as well as just the production design and all of that stuff is so interesting and weird. And like, as much as like you've talked about as well, like this movie scaring you as a child, like I don't know, it there is still a childhood kind of imagination that this movie has, which of course like is inherent with like the Oz, like, with that world. But yeah, it's such a strange movie, and it feels like a strange movie, especially for Disney, right? To make something this crazy and weird, and like it only comes out of like the 80s, which is a time when they're not doing so great necessarily. But yeah, it's weird. It's a weird one.
Yeah, and I think that's something we didn't really mention as much. Like you were talking about how this could only come from like a specific era for Disney. This is what a lot of people call the what Walt would have done era, where
Right.
post Walt Disney dying in like 66 until around like when the Disney Renaissance really kicks in like the late 80s. There's sort of this weird period of like, what are we gonna do? And I think a lot of those movies, quite frankly, are kind of unwatchable. Like, say, the original Pete's Dragon, I think, is, like, a terrible movie. Or, like, the Apple Dumpling Gang. Or there are even interesting ones that are kind of failures but curious, like The Black Hole or Watcher in the Woods or Something Wicked This Way Comes. Like, these are all, like, the darker sort of, like, late 70s, early 80s period Disney movies. I don't think most of those are, like, extremely successful as compared to, like, I think this is easily the best of that era. For sure, for me. This feels like because at the same time it has like all that creepiness, it also has a lot of heart and warmth that I think goes underrated when people talk about this movie. And it feels like Murch is so invested in like, I want to do justice to like these original books, and I want to be able to make a story that I'm not talking down to any kids when I'm making it. Like, any kid that watches this can believe in like the terrifying stakes of like being on a big fantasy adventure, even though weirdly it's so simplistic. Like, we haven't really talked about the fact that like
Right.
the basic structure of it is like, she's in the psychiatrist's office, she goes to Oz, she goes to the Emerald City, she goes to Mombi's castle, and then over to the Nome King's mountain, and then the story ends pretty much. There's not like a huge amount that really happens. Because even with, like, the Wizard of Oz, you go from, like, oh, here's this part of the forest where the Scarecrow is, and then where the Tin Man is, and then where the Lion is, and there's, like, whole sequences devoted to meeting these characters, versus we meet TikTok at the Emerald City, or everybody else inside of, like, Mombi's castle, and then we go see the Nome King. Like, it's not
Right.
a huge amount that happens, like, structurally, like, from plot beat to plot beat. But at the same time, you feel like you've gone through such a massive adventure because it's harrowing, truly. Just encounter, like, Mombi and the Wheelers and all these other things. And, yeah, I think it's why it's definitely, I think, one of the more underrated Disney movies to me, because at the same time, it has all that terror, it has all that heart that really mixed in, and it feels genuinely investing. Like, I felt so sad when she had to leave, and she hugs TikTok, and he starts crying. He cries. Emerald tears. But at the same time, Dorothy's also, like, she's a very empathetic character, and she's resourceful. She realizes the whole green thing with the different objects and stuff like that. Once again, Murch just knows that, like, I can't make this feel too safe, because like, kids are, like, smarter than that. Kids don't have to, like, be talked down to, which is a thing that, like, a lot of Disney movies are guilty of, in terms of just, like, we're gonna, like, dumb this down for a kid because we don't trust their intellect, as opposed to the better Disney movies, or even something like this, knows that, like, we can have, like, all this danger and terror, but just know that, like, she can get through it, she can have her friends alongside her, her weird misfit toy friends who aren't quite humanoid, and that makes the happy ending work all the better. And yeah, that's why I think this one definitely deserves a lot more love beyond just, like, this movie fucked me up. It's like, yeah, sure, it did, but there's still something underneath all of that, like, scary stuff and that's, like, surrounds it. It feels more like it evokes a lot of, like, the earlier Walt Disney things than, like, some of these other movies from around this time that kind of just use the scariness as, like, their one-trick pony. I find, like, some of the scary sequences in this recall some of the scarier sequences in, like, Pinocchio or, like, Snow White, with, like, the trees and stuff like that. It feels like it has that same sense of, like, terror and danger that also has a bit of heart and warmth underneath it at the same time.
Yeah.
But yeah, so let's get into our weekly segment, Between the Lines. So every episode, Bryan and I recommend another movie that's related to some degree to either the movie we're talking about or could apply as another entry in the atypical Disney kind of thing. And I'm going to be starting here. And my pick is one that was produced by Disney, though released under their Touchstone banner. And
R.I.P.
is a movie... R.I.P. to a real one. A label that literally was only resurrected to release stuff like Strange Magic, the George Lucas, like, Lucasfilm movie they got along with Star Wars. But this is from 2000, and it's a movie I know Bryan has seen, and it's my favorite movie from, I think, a great director. I have 2000's Unbreakable from M. Night Shyamalan.
Oh, yes.
It's weird to realize that the whole factor of, like, M. Night Shyamalan's rise to power was partially because of Disney helping along with, like, the whole story behind The Sixth Sense is so fascinating. When, like, I've been reading that Disney War book, and there was a whole thing where the guy who greenlit The Sixth Sense and agreed to let M. Night Shyamalan direct the movie got fired by Michael Eisner. It's like, we can't allow this guy to direct the movie. This is gonna be a huge fucking failure. And that guy was unemployed when it was making millions of dollars in, like, August of '99. So after that, Disney made Unbreakable, which is personally my favorite Shyamalan movie. If you're somehow unaware, this is a story of David Dunn, played by Bruce Willis, who is the seemingly average man who survives a horrible train wreck that kills thousands of people, but he's the one survivor. And he starts to realize, wait a minute, I've never been sick before. I've never had, like, really any illness or anything. And it's this interesting superhero origin story done through just the real tragedy of, like, well, if you were a superhero in our actual world, it would feel kind of like a curse that's, like, upon you, that you're able to, like, survive horrible blasts and stuff like that. And he, along the way, encounters this guy named Elijah, played by Samuel Jackson, who, by contrast, has this disease that makes his bones very brittle. and he is called Mr. Glass as sort of a moniker. They call him Mr. Glass, yes. It's sort of a name to tease him, but it's a whole movie that's basically about like the superhero origin story, but through the prism of like our natural world, and how if someone were to, be introduced as like, oh, you're a survivor of this horrible train crash, and you had no marks on you whatsoever, no blemishes, no like cuts or scars, it would draw some people out of the woodwork, like Elijah, which is a brilliant performance from Samuel Jackson.
Oh yeah,
that isn't like him screaming motherfucker all the time. It's like it's one of his more nuanced performances, and it's also an amazing performance from Bruce Willis. That's very like, this and Sixth Sense just show how talented that dude was at playing drama, especially like in a low key sense. And it's got like, amazing, like Robin Wright is also great in this. Spencer Treat Clark as their son is so good. It's this great movie about literally broken people realizing that they can maybe have some kind of life together, even though, there's all this like supernatural circumstances around them. They still just are trying to like get their marriage together, him and Robin Wright, or, all the stuff around like Elijah and like realizing what his whole plan is. It's so brilliantly done. It's so extremely well directed by M. Night, where there's so many great moments of particularly like Bruce Willis having this other power to be able to like sense people and like realize like, oh, their backstory and like what they were doing previously, their sins of sorts, is like so well directed, so well put together. An amazing James Newton Howard score.
I was gonna say, yeah,
that fucking rocks. It's such a great movie. It's my favorite Shyamalan movie, and also the weird start of a trilogy that would later happen. Mostly not with Disney, which is also very weird.
Right.
Like where Universal does split, and then they just were able to get, like, he has the character rights to David Dunn, so he's able to put him in this. It's so weird how that fucking happened still to this day. But yeah, tremendous movie. One of my favorites, especially a very weird movie for Disney to put out.
Yeah, it's one of those things where you say like, Disney made this. Like, Disney made this movie. They
Michael Eisner era Disney made this.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's a masterpiece. It is like a superhero movie, like you said, but it's very grounded in our real world, and also just, I think M. Night is one of the most empathetic storytellers, especially in the past like 20 years. He's just or 30 years, like basically he is like such an empathetic filmmaker. He really loves people and really understands people and wants to like understand how people work, and just the like my favorite scenes in the movie are with Bruce Willis and his son, like just really beautiful drama. Like I just their
the thing
relationship.
with the gun is one of the best like scenes Shyamalan's ever directed. It's like so much tension but so much sadness in there, and then of course when the newspaper and just
that's what I was gonna say. Unbelievable. Yeah. It's a masterpiece. It's a great movie, and also weird that it started this trilogy. And I think both of the other movies are great as well. But there is something very special about Unbreakable.
Well, Brian, what is your recommendation?
Yeah, so my recommendation is a Disney movie, a Walt Disney movie, released in 1999. By a filmmaker named David Lynch, and it is The Straight Story, which I had seen back in like high school when I kind of discovered Lynch, and I had the realization, like I think most other people do, of like, oh, he made a Disney movie? Oh, it's about a guy who goes on a trip on his lawnmower to visit his brother? I don't know. What is this?
Based on a true story? It's not like weird phantasmical nightmare vision?
Right, and it's kind of released like in between Lost Highway and Mulholland Drive in his career. And yeah, so it is a story about an elderly guy named Alvin Straight who learns that his brother has had a stroke, and he decides that he needs to go visit him and reconnect with him. They haven't spoken in about 10 years. He's living with his daughter, played by Sissy Spacek. He can't drive a car because he doesn't have a license, because he's older, his eyesight is bad and all of that. And so he decides to go on his lawnmower, and he sort of sleeps in like a trailer in the back. It's like a makeshift trailer, and the film is mostly him sort of encountering various people and having conversations and just discovering more about him, but also more about strangers. Like there's a really great scene early on his trip where he meets this woman who he finds out is pregnant, and they learn things about each other, which is just, this movie is heartbreaking. I mean, I remember just kind of going like, oh, this is like a fine kind of movie. And I watched it last night and it broke me. I think this is a absolute masterpiece. I like, and really up there with like any of David Lynch's other films, like Mulholland Drive or like Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me. Like, it is an incredibly human movie, which I think is something that can often get lost with Lynch, is that like, he's weird, he's got like eccentric characters, right? Like, you know, but he's very good at human drama, and he's a bit of a sap, right? He loves The Wizard of Oz, he loves like Jimmy Stewart and stuff like that. So he has that side of him, and this movie is just a incredibly beautiful movie about aging and about getting older, and also about family, and about like, I mean, the relationship with him and Sissy Spacek, which I won't give it really much away because I had forgotten that aspect of the movie when I watched it last night, and it just like broke my heart. It's so incredible. And like, I mean, Sissy Spacek, who is playing someone who is, I guess, sort of on the spectrum in some way. It's never really specific, but like,
Right, yeah.
It feels so respectful and so like human, which I was not expecting, obviously, but because that's kind of something that can go very wrong. But
Particularly in a 90s movie.
exactly. Yeah, but there's also great cameos from like a few Twin Peaks actors in here, and it's, I mean, the score by Angelo Badalamenti, rest in peace. I had forgotten how unbelievably lush and gorgeous it is, while also having like a kind of more country kind of twang to it at times. Yeah, I really love this movie. I was really blown away by how great it was. And yeah, it's one of his best films, which, you know, is really saying something for David Lynch. But yeah, you've also seen this movie. What do you think about this movie?
I have, yeah. This is one of the more recent, like, when I was checking off, like, the blind spots of Lynch, this was, like, this and Inland Empire, like, the last two I had to catch up on,
Right.
pretty much. I'm like, oh, I can watch it on Disney Plus right now.
Right, yeah.
Yep. I remember at the time still thinking, like, I really liked it, but I would still say it was, like, one of the lesser Lynches, which is not saying anything bad at all.
Right, yeah.
Like, the only technically bad David Lynch movie I would argue is Dune, and that still is, like, interesting and weird.
Fascinating movie, yeah.
Fascinating movie, right? As opposed to this, despite being, like, much more simplistic and much more straight, as it were, is still feels very grounded in, like, his sensibilities at the same time, that kind of, like you mentioned, that human element of it, the kind of odyssey thing that makes him very tied to, like, Wizard of Oz. It feels kind of like it's this guy going on this journey, which also, just a shout out, Richard Farnsworth is the main actor. Amazing. One of his last performances. A great, weird career for that, too, dude. He was, like, a classic Hollywood stuntman, and then later in life had gotten, like, a lot of more on-camera roles, like in Misery prior to this and stuff like that. But this is kind of like his swan song performance shortly before his passing. And I think it does such a great job of, like, having those Lynch kind of ties, but also being just this very quiet, introspective movie, like you mentioned, about aging. The last sort of scene of this movie, when he encounters his brother, who I won't spoil who it is, but is one of the Lynch regulars, and, like, the perfect person to play that brother character. Like, that brief conversation they have, and then him looking up into the stars in just that Stargate before, like, the end credits start, feels once again very Lynchian in terms of just his fascination with, like, the unknown of, like, what happens after, you know, we leave the mortal coil. It's all still there, while, you know, none of the, like, more extravagant, like, wacky things that we see in his other movies happen.
While also having, like, there are very funny and interesting characters that he meets. Like, I love, like, there's a scene that is in a store where he's like, what do you need that grabber for? And
Oh,
it's
yeah.
like, grabbing. There's a lot, there's a lot of still, like, funny, like, I think Lynch is very funny when he wants to be, but, like, it more comes across in, like, those secondary characters that he meets, and just, like, them being very, like, funny, like, normal people. But yeah, the humanity of this movie is the most powerful part of it, and it made me just fucking weep. Like, it's so beautiful.
Yeah, a very underrated movie as well, and very atypical for Disney.
Right, and atypical for David Lynch in that it's not that weird.
Right. Yes. But yeah, let's go ahead and repeat our titles then. My recommendation was the 2000 M. Night Shyamalan film Unbreakable.
And I had David Lynch's 1999 film The Straight Story.
And now we gotta do our thank yous and everything. We gotta head out of here, so we want to thank some people like Burial Grid for our music for the show. Purchase his music at burialgrid.com. Thanks to Michelle Kyle for our artwork. Find her at MishKyle96 on Twitter. And thanks to our Patreon supporters at patreon.com/cinema2letter, where for just $1 a month, you all get to listen to bonus podcasts that we put out. Like around this time, we would have, put out our big Disney YouTube commentary conversation, where Bryan and I talk about a big YouTube playlist of stuff. And also, before the end of the year, in a couple days, we'll have out our big review roundup, where we talk about a bunch of the big December releases, a bunch of the Oscar things and stuff we'll be talking about. And also, you get to vote in polls for certain movies we cover, which, stay tuned to the very end here, where we're going to talk about a poll that'll be coming out shortly after this episode releases for our next season, which we'll announce in just a bit. But, that $1 a month really helps out and helps keep the lights on, and we really appreciate it from all our patrons currently, and would appreciate, if you love this show at all, if you like listening to it, definitely consider becoming a patron and helping us out. But you can find us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, all the other social medias at cinema2letter. And you can find me specifically at Not the Who's Tommy on Twitter and Letterboxd. And I also do some writing at marianithomas.wordpress.com and at film-cred.com.
Yeah, and you can find me on Twitter as well, sometimes at BRYANDRADE and the number 3. Or you can follow me on Letterboxd, which, catching up on all those 2023 movies that I missed. So, got to get that 2023 list up to date. Follow me on there.
And for more of this show, please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts or whatever podcasting platform that you listen to us on. If you're listening on Talk Film Society, you want to listen to all the other great shows on the network. And you can also dig into our archives and our Podbean main feed for all 3 seasons of this show that have happened so far, and all the old Double Edge Double Bill stuff is all there. And nothing else. If you can't support us on the Patreon, that's cool. Money can be tight for people. The free way to help us out is to rate, review, or simply share the show around to give us more visibility, especially as we are stuck in the dilapidated Emerald City. Turned to stone. I need people to hear our voices. We need Dorothy Gales out there to help us.
The Wheelers are coming.
Oh, the Wheelers are coming for us. Oh, God. Well, now, let's tease Bryan. This is the end of the Disney season, so we'll be taking a bit of a break, but we'll be coming back in the new year on specifically January 23rd for Season 4, which we're tying into the Oscars, which the nominees will be announced on that particular Tuesday. We'll be going through that in-between point between the nominations and the ceremony, and we'll just announce here that the Season 4 specific topic is very broad in terms of it's any movie that's won at least one Oscar. That's what we're going with. Not just Best Picture winners. It can be you won a makeup award, you won a special effects Oscar, you won, sound mixing, but not sound editing. You're applicable, baby.
But we are not doing honorary Oscars, none of that. It has to be during, how would you say that?
A competitive Oscar. We have to be winning a competitive Oscar, yes. We'll be announcing those titles. We'll have a little bonus episode about a week prior where we'll announce the specific movies we'll be covering. And we should at least announce that one title will be chosen by our patrons. There will be a poll the day after this episode drops, so on the 27th of December. You all who are patrons will be able to vote for our M for Masterpiece choice, which we decided on the 2 choices will be the 1997 Gus Van Sant film Good Will Hunting, versus the 2007 Tony Gilroy film, Michael Clayton.
Both very interesting movies to talk about. Interesting, like, careers in terms of their directors.
And also both were their major awards that they won. Where Good Will Hunting won a screenplay, but also Best Actor for Robin Williams. And then Michael Clayton's only Oscar win was for Tilda Swinton in the least Tilda Swinton-y role.
Yeah. And also an interesting thing of, like, Michael Clayton, for me at least, is Michael Clayton's a movie I have watched only up until recently, and I have not seen Good Will Hunting in a very long time. It was when I saw, like, back in high school, and I have not seen it since. So either choice is interesting.
I'm in a similar track as well with that. I'm very curious to revisit either Good Will Hunting or Michael Clayton, depending on what the patrons pick. That's for you all to decide, though. Like I said, that poll will be going up the day after this episode drops, and it'll be up for a couple days. So you'll be able to help us curate this particular list of films. So one of those will be up to the patrons, and we'll announce officially which one won come our little bonus episode. They'll come out before the first episode drops. But until then, everybody, the Disney season's over. So that means we're out of the mouse's hair. Get the fuck out of here, Mickey. We're not dealing with you anymore. Enjoy your flop era, motherfucker.
Happy 100 years. Anyways, how's the box office doing?
Right, yeah. Now, how's Wish doing, motherfucker? But yeah, until then, everybody, we're off to see The Wizard, or maybe more The Nome King and his horrible fucking stone creations. We're stuck in Oz, but, you know, some fun guys. We like TikTok. We like hanging out with him.
What
He's
a guy.
Cool dude. We gotta wind up his action, though, in his mind, or else he'll just go crazy. So we gotta do that. Goodbye, everybody.